Stefan Papadakis, team owner of the Rockstar Energy Drink GR Supra Drift Team that Frederick Osbo drives. And today we're talking about angle of the car and basically how we get these cars to drift at really high angles. So in order to drift at really high angles, first thing you need is a lot of steering angle, because really generally you can only drift with as much angle as you can get with the steering. Stock is about 30, 35 degrees of steering angle. We're over 60, close to 70 degrees of steering angle. And in order to do that, we run a totally different WiseFab suspension, and all the spindle and the upper control arms and everything has been changed for a drift specific. And some of the things that are changed are the geometry for the amount of caster. Caster is the angle from the top pivot point on the front suspension to the pivot of where the spindle operates. So that is the caster, and depending on how you turn, it'll change the dynamic camber of the front wheel. Caster trail is where that line, how much setback you have from that line of where the wheel is actually pivoting. So we might draw an angle of, let's say, 6 degrees of caster, and then if we set it back an inch or two, then we've got an inch or two of caster trail. So that would be like the shopping cart part, and then the caster part is the traditional, like the front of a bicycle or like a beach cruiser, like a big Harley has a bunch of caster, and then maybe like a street bike has a lot less caster on the front end, and yeah.
So some guys like to run a little bit more Ackerman. Back in the day, guys used to cut knuckles, and that would give you a ton of Ackerman, so the car would have very good steering feel. It would have really good self-steer, but it wouldn't be that fast. So this is kind of the middle. We have to steer the car a little more. It's not so much of just letting go of the steering wheel on transitions so much anymore, but kind of walking the wheel through it as we transition. But it makes for the fastest setup and the most consistent and easy to basically follow, and not just like go to full lock and lose distance from the other car. We also do a lot with dampening setup. So especially on a track like this in Orlando here, it's very bumpy coming off the bank. It's very bumpy through the center section, and you need to have the right spring rates and the right dampening setup for your car on the specific track with the specific tires that you run and what pressures in the tires you run. The tire can act like a spring and a shock also. So if you have a really stiff setup, sometimes it's just the tire that's bouncing around. If you have a really soft setup, sometimes you get this weird oscillation and the car does like a lot of bounces and wiggles around a lot, and it's really hard to drive. So having a very good set of shocks on the car makes a big difference.
This is pretty close to lock. It's really hard to get lock static because there's jacking that plays into effect on the front end, which helps weight transfer. So that's another thing that you want to kind of like take into consideration when you're working on an angle kit is how the front end affects the rear end to get more grip. So it's not only about making angle, but it's also about like transferring weight to get more grip into the car. I mean, these cars we're fighting how much horsepower, how much grip, and that balance of both to get as much angle but still get a lot of like forward momentum and forward push to go fast through the track. There's so many cars that are just rocket ships out here, so you can't run like too much angle where you're scrubbing too much speed. You just have to find that balance. And you know, these tires help out a lot too. Switching to the 660 on the front, these things are super grippy, and we had to make some adjustments because there was so much more grip than the old setup. But that just allows you to get a little bit more aggressive with things, dial more grip into the rear because you have more grip in the front as well, which is very helpful. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of like my setup. It's a little bit adjustable, not as adjustable as other kits out there, but two, I think if you put too much into the end user's hand, they can make mistakes in the setup or not really know how to tune it properly. So I kind of just set it and forget it. I kind of send my kits out with what I think works well, and there's some adjustability in it, you know, caster, and you can obviously adjust toe and camber. But my Ackerman is pretty much set where I like to drive, and it seems to work out pretty well for a lot of people.
Every single link and arm, top mount even for the front shocks, is all aftermarket, and it's custom suited for massive angle and to correct the suspension geometry, because we lower these cars quite a bit for low center of gravity. So that being done, Everything has to be recalculated so the roll center is just perfect. And then obviously somehow we have to squeeze out about 65 degrees of steering angle out of these cars. You gotta be very mindful when you do that. If you squeeze out that much angle and things aren't done right, say your steering rack isn't in the right position, your Ackerman's gonna be through the roof, it's gonna be super negative or way too positive. And if you get greedy with angle without addressing some of the fundamental geometry little tricks, you're gonna have binding issues. The car's just gonna be undrivable at that angle.